First, we're going to talk about upcoming changes on the horizon and browser changes. So we have a number of changes coming, and they all impact marketing's ability to collect data and put the contacts that they have in their database into action. So we'll be talking about third-party cookies, first-party cookies, and Topics API, which is Google's latest plan to replace FLoC. So this is why it matters. The majority, all users typically access the internet using a specific browser. Chrome, Safari, Edge, and Firefox, mostly Chrome, have the market share. So I believe Android also leverages Chrome, Safari's on Apple OS, and the changes they make to their browsers drastically impact our ability to track and receive information from the browser or even the machine. So third-party cookies, I want to differentiate between the two because they're treated differently and they act differently. Third-party cookies are typically from script you put on your website that are calling from a third-party server to collect information. So the information isn't calling or being received on your server. This is information that is used by, let's say, retargeting companies, or even some social platforms still use third-party cookies, although a lot have moved to first. And what they're doing is they're tracking a user's movement as they move around the internet. So, sorry, let's go back for a second. Safari has already blocked third-party cookies. Firefox did as well. You saw that they have a very minor market share. The reason why the market's pretty abuzz with cookies on the mind is that Chrome is planning to discontinue third-party cookies as well. So that change has been postponed. I believe the latest I heard is 2023, although they may push out even further. So just keep that in mind. It does impact the ability for some service providers to retarget and put advertising in front of people who have landed on your website in the past. So it's something to keep in mind. A lot of these advertisers are finding ways around this issue, and we'll talk about that as well. So, are all cookies crumbling? I love Kathy's puns. This is beautiful. So third-party cookies, yes, they will all be blocked. Right now, Apple is probably the most aggressive of the most common browsers. There are more secure browsers out there that are used, but Apple probably is the most aggressive about eliminating first-party cookies. So if you are tracking PII, or personally identifiable information, Apple limits the lifespan of the cookie to 24 hours. So if you're using a web tracking script and trying to identify people who are hitting on your site, if you're using even a first-party cookie, they only have 24 hours to identify if the IP address isn't recognized. So the amount of time we have to associate somebody's contact information with all of their visits on our website are shortening. This change has not taken place with Chrome, and there haven't been rumblings yet about this taking place with Chrome, but it's just something to keep in mind. Apple tends to be at the forefront, so we do anticipate this change coming down the line. So briefly, we'll touch on Topics AI. What is it? FLoC's replacement. So instead of storing third-party cookies or storing browser history information in the browser itself, the intent here is, instead of passing personally identified information, Chrome plans to store up to 3 topics based on the person's web browsing activity on the browser and pass that information to your domain, so you can somewhat personalize their site without identifying the individual. So in the future, the intent is to have things like health and fitness or pets or topics along those lines that get passed through the browser to the domain in order for retailers and advertisers to present the right material to the person. So these topics will be stored for a maximum of 3 weeks, and then they're replaced by other topics. So we have links to documentation on the slides we'll be sending out, so you can research this more. It's an interesting alternative because they're not planning on passing any personally identifiable information. So we'll see. Flock blew up pretty spectacularly, so we'll see how this one goes. Okay, so let's talk about the legal changes. Some of the changes we talked about in the browsers themselves, which impact our ability to track and store information, are coming about because of regulatory changes. Not all of them, though. Some of them are a bit self-serving. For example, if I wanted to own the information of all the people using browsers and all the activity, this is a really good way to go about it. Not saying that Google's doing that, but we have suspicions that it's not completely altruistic, this move to privacy first. I do want to say a note, and our lawyer wants us to say a note, that we are not lawyers and we are not dishing out legal advice. We have linked to the different regulatory or regulations and laws out there. We encourage you to do your own research. The recommendations I make may be more stringent than what your lawyer wants you to do, or maybe less stringent. So in my opinion, GDPR so far has set the gold standard for everyone else. So we have several laws coming to fruition or have come to fruition in the US that are following along GDPR's guidelines. I would say GDPR is the most stringent. I have dealt with data privacy regulations in APAC as well. And I think the bar is a little bit lower there. We'll also touch on the EU's latest ruling against Google and what that means for marketers. So, like I mentioned or touched on at the very first part, if you've ever seen Social Dilemma, you may also share my suspicion that we may have gotten into this mess ourselves by taking advantage of all the information. So let's talk about what PII is, and then we'll dive into the regulations. So personally identifiable information isn't just your social security number, name, and phone number. It's any identifier that can be used to differentiate one person from another. That includes hashed email, IP addresses, and cookie identifiers. So at Caliber Mind, we use a first-party cookie to track web interactions and make UTM tracking more persistent. Unfortunately, those cookie identifiers that put a unique ID on the person's browser are still considered PII. So we have to be very cognizant about how apps that disable those cookies impact the data that we're collecting, and also how we can best put those guardrails in place in order to protect people who are in the EU or citizens in the EU that are elsewhere. So you may have heard me say in the EU or citizens elsewhere. That is because you do not have to be doing business in the EU to be impacted by GDPR. It doesn't matter which countries you're actively selling to. It matters where the person hitting your website is either physically located in at the time they hit your website or where their residence is. Technically, EU citizens are supposed to be protected even when they're outside of the EU. So it's really tricky to understand when people's IP addresses change it's really hard to identify where people are coming from. So a lot of companies are taking the most cautious approach to managing people's information. At minimum, now again, these alerts may be more stringent than your legal team suggests or less. So it's really important for you to work with legal to figure out what you need to do as a company. But at minimum, it's my belief that websites need to alert users when cookies are enabled. Ideally, they have the ability to toggle certain cookies on or off. And in order for any PII to be collected, this includes IP addresses or those first-party cookies I was mentioning that had unique identifiers, a person must explicitly opt in. Now, how companies translate this varies. I've seen everything from a note at the bottom of a web form that says, check out our privacy policy, to a checkbox that says, I understand that providing this information, I may be contacted. I've seen the whole gamut. So again, work with your legal department to determine what the right fit is for you. And note that some countries, such as Germany, require a double opt-in. So that means once they opt in by filling out a form, you also are supposed to send them an email to confirm that their intent was to subscribe. And then keep in mind that all companies must have a mechanism that allows them to purge all personally identifiable information upon request. So not only are we not supposed to be collecting the information without approval, we're also supposed to have a mechanism that can purge that data once somebody says, hey, I want to opt out. So the penalty for not complying, there are some guardrails around company size, but in general, the penalty is either 20 million euros or 14% of a company's global turnover, whichever is higher. So it's pretty steep. And again, you don't have to be proactively doing business in the EU to be impacted by GDPR. What matters is who's visiting your website. And since we're all global citizens online, it's really easy for people in the EU to find us. Okay, so the ruling against Google is basically, they said it was illegal to use GA4 in the EU, and that's because IP addresses were being stored. So the reason why this is a big red flag for those of us in marketing is because a lot of us have the ability to read machine IDs and IP addresses associated with users that hit our website. When we store that information, we're storing PII, and if we're doing it without permission, we're basically making ourselves a potential target for litigation in the EU. So just be aware that this is kind of like the first red flag that made it really clear that IP addresses and first-party cookie identifiers are considered PII. And it's also a reason why we're hearing rumblings about social media platforms like LinkedIn changing how they do business. For example, how they allow us to target their audiences. So expect more changes on the horizon. One thing I want to touch on really quickly are the US states that are passing legislation. So for example, California passed a law in 2020. I believe New York Shield has also been passed. And then we've got some litigation or some legislation that's being planned in Virginia and some other states. So what I recommend is basically using GDPR as your gold standard, setting up the ability to note when people opt in, when they opt out, and having a mechanism to purge that data. So you're set up for any changes that are on the horizon. In my opinion, and again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not giving legal advice, but in my opinion, it's best to be overly cautious than have to reconfigure your systems and change how you do business later. And then this brings us to data management, which is the next change on the horizon. First-party data is going to become everything. It's going to be harder and harder to enrich the data we have using third-party vendors. So first-party data is going to be gold. So we have a major conflict in the market. 80% of consumers value personalization. 90% of consumers find personalization appealing, but most people are aware of the privacy violations happening and they want to stay private. So how do we meet people in the middle? So collecting the right information and enriching what you can while you can is going to help you advertise to the right audience, understand trends and predict performance, and personalize web experiences. So for example, if I collect enough information now, and I'm offering enough value for people to feel comfortable exchanging their personal information to me, I can use that information and give it to the publishers that have rights. So for example, the New York Times, CNN, something along those lines, because people are logging into those platforms with their email addresses. If I'm collecting email addresses and people trust me because I'm providing value, I can then turn around and provide those email addresses to the publishers so that my ads can show up in front of the right audiences. It also helps me personalize web experiences. So if I provide enough value to incentivize people to log into my site, I can store information that shows what they've purchased in the past and give recommendations on what they want to purchase in the future. Think of Amazon. So I know there's a lot of changes happening, but the future is bright. It's going to be all about creating a content strategy that provides information that people need and want. Just to kind of recap, we talked about developing and publishing policies, working with legal. Again, don't wait to expand your business or do business in the EU to start adopting policies and processes. That's kind of asking for trouble. Optimize systems and processes. Don't put up too many gates. So like I said, it is in our best interest to grow our first-party database, but don't do it by gating all of your content and annoying your website users. Remember the personal info. There is an exchange rate. So it's give and take, not take and take. So no product spewing. Make sure you're providing value and look at what other content providers are doing in the space that's creative and providing value to their end users. And then actualize and amplify. So it's really critical to have processes and systems in place to clean, deduplicate, and make sure your data is in the best state possible to segment your users and be able to use that data with your first-party publishers. And as Kathy mentioned, on May 17th, we've got a webinar on delivering the right data to the board. So if people have prepared presentations and been frustrated by the slew of questions that come afterwards and up to 2 to 3 weeks of digging into the data to answer those questions, we'll give you tips and tricks on how to avoid that work by providing the right data to begin with. And I just thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it.